Good afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish. Apologies for the late start today on Sunday the 16th of February. My name is Brian Liddy and I'm joined today by Francis Coppola, the economist, and also by Paul McLennan, MSP for East Lothian. Thank you to both of you for giving up, again, another sizable chunk of your weekend. We really appreciate it.
Good afternoon, Brian.
Oh, so today is the 1089th day of the war in Ukraine. US and Russian officials are set to meet in Saudi Arabia next week to start talks aimed at ending Moscow's nearly 3-year war in Ukraine, Reuters and AFP reported, citing US officials. The US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, and the Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, will form the US delegation at the meeting, which may pave the way for a potential leaders' summit as soon as the end of the month, the news agencies reported. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Ukraine had not been invited to the talks and that Kyiv would not engage with Russia before consulting with strategic partners. Rubio and the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov discussed the situation in Ukraine in a call on Saturday, as well as the removal of unilateral barriers set by previous US administrations, according to Moscow. Two sides expressed their mutual willingness to interact on pressing international issues, including the settlement around Ukraine, the Russian Foreign Ministry said in a statement. Moscow said the pair agreed on regular contacts to prepare for a meeting between the Russian President Vladimir Putin and his US counterpart, Donald Trump. Trump's special envoy for Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, said Europe will be consulted but ultimately excluded from the talks between Russia, Ukraine and the US. To my European friends, I would say, get into the debate not by complaining that you might, yes or not, be at the table, but by coming up with concrete proposals, ideas, ramp up defence spending. Kellogg said it at the Munich Security Conference yesterday. And Zelensky told the Munich conference that the time had come for a European army to be created. Our army alone is not enough, we need your support, he said yesterday, adding that the old days when the US supported Europe just because it always had are over. He also told leaders and officials that he would not take NATO membership for Ukraine off the table and insisted that no decision should be taken on ending Russia's war without Kyiv and Europe. French President Emmanuel Macron was on Saturday night seeking to convene an emergency meeting of European leaders, including the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, as concerns grew over Trump's attempts to seize control of the Ukraine peace process. The meeting, likely to be held on Monday, is expected to discuss US efforts to exclude European leaders from the peace talks, the position Europe should adopt on Ukraine's membership of NATO, and how Ukraine can be offered security guarantees, either through NATO or some other European force. Finland's President Alexander Stubb said Europe needs to talk less and do more in response to the prospect of being shut out of talks. There's no way in which we can have discussions or negotiations about Ukraine, Ukraine's future or European security structure without Europeans, Stubb told reporters in Munich. He went on to say, but this means that Europe needs to get its act together. The UK Foreign Minister David Lammy said he would encourage Trump and Zelensky to deepen their partnership in the future. Speaking at the Munich conference on Saturday, Lammy said the best security guarantee for Ukraine against future Russian aggression was binding US industry, business and defence capability into its future. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said the war between Ukraine and Russia would only truly end with peace if Ukrainian sovereignty is secured. We will also not accept any solution that leads to a decoupling of European and American security. Only one person would benefit from this, President Putin, Scholz said yesterday. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha and Zelensky's Chief of Staff Andriy Yermak have discussed Kyiv's vision of a path to peace with China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Sybiha said on X the meeting that took place on the sidelines of the Munich conference was to reaffirm mutual respect for territorial integrity. On Friday, Wang told the conference that China believes all stakeholders in the Russian-Ukraine conflict should participate in the peace talks, underscoring Europe's role in them. Trump's administration has proposed to Ukraine that the US be given 50% of the war-torn country's rare earth minerals, NBC has reported. Instead of paying for the minerals, the agreement would be a way for Ukraine to pay back the multi-billion-dollar weapons and aid packages that the US has provided to it since Russia's invasion in 2022. Zelensky said the rare earth mineral deal proposed by the US did not contain security provisions that Ukraine needed. Upon being asked by reporters what the issue was with the US document, Zelensky said on Saturday, "It's not in our interest today, not in the interest of sovereign Ukraine." Francis, not only was that maybe one of the longer Ukraine updates that I've ever had to deliver on here, but I think it's everything seems to have seriously ramped up. Would you agree?
I think the ground has shifted, and I would have to say that this has been signalled for quite some time by the forthcoming President Trump. He's insisted that there would have been no war if he had been president, which to my mind suggests that he would simply have given in to Putin right from the start and let Putin take Ukraine. And I don't think he has seriously shifted from that. And I would say also the rare earths proposal looks to me like a retrospective attempt to impose lend-lease. So rather than military aid to Ukraine, he now wants it treated as a loan and paid back without any guarantees that Ukraine will remain an independent country. It's clearly a non-starter, and I think the problem here is that the ball is now firmly back in Europe's court. Europe collectively has actually given Ukraine more aid than America, though not as much military aid. It's given a lot more economic aid. But Trump is essentially saying, Europe, this is your problem. It's your border with Russia. Secure your borders. It's not my problem. It's essentially the message he's giving, which is a major shift, really, from where we thought we were. But I would also have to say that the Biden administration had become very lukewarm over Ukraine. After the initial flurry of, we will support it forever, it all went off the boil, rather. And what we ended up with was this, not enough aid to keep the war going, but not enough to finish it, which wasn't a satisfactory situation either. I don't know where we go from here, but it does seem clear to me that Trump has tucked the ball very firmly back into Europe's court, and it's now up to the European powers to decide what they're going to do.
Thank you, Francis. Paul, I'm wondering if maybe you might either be able to tell us what kind of discussions are going on in Hollywood around what's happening in Ukraine and President Trump. But in the media all this week, I've been seeing constant references to Chamberlain and drawing similarities to 1938 and Czechoslovakia and the build up to the Second World War. Do you think, and now there's talk about creating a European army. President Zelensky, I think, has called for that. Do you think we are kind of looking at a similar situation to 1938 in Europe?
I'm not sure if we're looking at a situation in 1930 in Europe, but I'd agree with Francis. I think we are seeing a ground shift in US foreign policy. I think it's kind of indicative of probably the last number of years in the Biden, and before that, there was no exit strategies to any conflict that the US were involved in at all. And we've seen it in Afghanistan, we've seen it in Iraq, we've seen it in Syria, and so on. I think what we're seeing here at the moment with President Trump is this simplistic view. I know we'll go on to Gaza later on in the show, but in terms of where he is with Ukraine, I think he was asked, and his defence secretary was asked, what concessions have you asked from President Putin? And he's literally put in a position to say, look, the borders will be as they are at the moment. And President Putin walks away with exactly what he went into the discussion with. So I think there is a discussion that needs to be had with the European Commission, if you like, or the European partners in terms of what we go beyond this, because it's quite clear that President Trump has changed that view. He's not going to change his position going forward. It's very simplistic, very, very simplistic. And I think we've seen that. So it's a worrying time. I think there is that discussion required now by European partners in terms of what they do around about Ukraine, but also strategically going forward as well. It's obvious that President Trump isn't going to change, and his simplistic view doesn't work. It's as simple as that.
Thank you, Paul. You mentioned Gaza, so this week's update on what's going on in Gaza is at least 48,264 Palestinians have been killed and 111,688 have been wounded in Gaza since the 7th of October 2023. 3 more Israeli hostages were released by Hamas in Gaza yesterday, while Israel released 369 Palestinians after negotiations calmed the situation following Trump's deadline to release all hostages. Trump says he will support Israel to resume its offensive, risking phase 2 of the ceasefire. Paul, I've heard again in the media references to the fact that people seem to be saying that President Trump is hoping to get nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Do you think he's going about it the right way here in Gaza?
Not at all. I think the US historically has always been a supporter of the Israeli state, and I think this is probably the most support you'll see given this is the Israeli state. There is no concern. There is no consideration for the people of Gaza. President Trump's ridiculous idea around about taking control of the land, and I think he talked about being a Riviera, is just ridiculous. It's ignorant. It's ridiculous. It's their land as the people of Gaza. It's their land, and he should be pushing the two-state solution rather than this ridiculous position that he's taking. And again, it comes back to the overly, almost childish, I suppose, way in looking at the situation. And just move the people out. In no way coming back in. Change it to a Riviera, as he says, and in terms of this, it's laughable. It's childish. In terms of his outlook on it, and it's just a ridiculous situation. I have real concerns about whether President Trump supports phase 2 of the ceasefire, and obviously that would involve moving all Israeli forces. Let's wait and see where this goes in the next few weeks, but I have real concerns that Netanyahu will be encouraged, as he has been, I think, in the last week or two, to go back in and with military force. And we need to get to phase 2 as soon as we possibly can to make sure that Israeli troops withdraw and we start to rebuild Gaza as soon as possible. Now, I think Egypt has talked about it would support the rebuild financially, but we need to get to phase 2 and then obviously move on to phase 3 when the rebuild can start. But I have real concerns that President Trump will just rip up that agreement and encourage Netanyahu to go back to what he was doing before.
Thank you, Paul. Francis, what's your take on the situation in Gaza this week?
Fluid, I think, it's where we are. I mean, certainly President Trump's proposal has, I think, permanently now killed the two-state solution. That was settled US policy. It now is no longer settled US policy. He hasn't yet said what he thinks should be done about the West Bank, but we shouldn't forget that Israel at the moment is actively ethnically cleansing the West Bank. Nobody's stopping it. Nobody's really even talking about it. And as it stands, the US's position on all of this is get rid of the Palestinians, as far as I can tell, which is not a two-state solution. So while that remains the US's position, the question once again is what the position of the rest of the world will be. And in this case, particularly, I think, the position of the Arab states, who have had, rather as Trump has chucked the ball into Europe's court regarding Ukraine, Trump has chucked the ball into the Arab states' court regarding Gaza and Palestine more broadly, to come up with an alternative solution. So they are now scrambling around to try and do that. And the big problem, and the problem in Palestine really throughout the 77 years of Israel's existence, has always been that the Arab states have never once presented a united front on this. Not once. They've always crumbled and fallen apart, and each state has pursued its own interests in the final analysis, and the people who lose out every time are the Palestinians. I'm not entirely sure that this time is going to be different, really.
Thank you, Francis. I think we'll move on to the next item, which is European security. This week's European Security Conference saw the US throw a hand grenade into NATO's unity and forced European leaders to consider the future for European security without the commitment of the US. This, I think, is probably related to Trump saying that there's no way that the Ukraine is going to be allowed to join NATO, while European leaders are saying that they think that will be allowed to join NATO. Pax Americana, this notion that the US will always protect or stand up for Europe in times of war, again with Trump, seems to be a thing of the past. And since Brexit, the UK is no longer in the EU, which means that if the EU does decide to develop its own army, where would Britain be caught between America on one side and the EU army on the other one? I'm going to stop rambling now and come to you, Francis. Again, headlines in the media seem to be hinting at this is like the run up to potentially World War III, or am I overreacting?
I think it comes back to what I was saying before, and indeed what I thought even before Trump came to power, which is that what Trump really wants to do is dismantle NATO. I think he sees it as an anachronism, that America should not be involved in the defence of Europe, and that Europe should defend itself. And to the extent that European powers, many European countries, have arguably underspent on defence and relied very much upon the Pax Americana, in that respect, he has a point. The question is, as I said, what Europe will do about this. I don't think the fact that the UK is not in the EU is necessarily a major issue here, because geography wins every time. If there's a major war in Europe, the UK is involved whether it likes it or not, and America is much less involved, and that's simply because of distance. So the UK will be involved in whatever security discussions there are in Europe, whether or not it's a member of the EU. Should remind you, not all countries in Europe are members of the EU anyway. This is wider than the EU, and I think we should not think of it as an EU problem. We should think of it as a Europe problem, and there's the need for stronger strategic alliances between European countries, I think, simply because I think we simply have to stop relying on America. It would not surprise me to see Trump pull America out of NATO.
Francis. Paul, what do you think? What way would Britain have to face, or the UK have to face, if it's not in the EU and there is an EU army, and America on the other side? Which way would we face, in your opinion?
I would agree with Francis. First of all, I don't think there's anything off the table with President Trump. We've already seen some of the ridiculous ideas that's kind of coming up, and I think we've seen his defence secretary and the vice president talk about it as well. I think they haven't thought through their foreign policy, because it just seems to be made up as it kind of goes along. I think that's one of the key things. So there's the uncertainty of that. I think there's also the political uncertainty in Europe. Also, we're going to see a strong showing from the AfD in Germany. They won't form the government, but they're going to be an important part in the German parliament. In terms of that, we've seen the right-leaning government in Italy. Obviously, we've seen close shave, obviously, with the right wing in France as well. So I think there's a political uncertainty that's kind of going on that may or may not be difficult to form a pan-European position, and I think that's important. I think there needs to be discussions, and I think Francis again is right in terms of it doesn't need to involve being in the EU. It needs to be pan-European, obviously, because the UK would obviously need to be an important part of that. Moving towards the 5% defence spending target that President Trump's talked about is a huge increase. And again, the US themselves aren't there. They're only at about 3.4%, so they're not even there themselves. And there's no commitment from President Trump to do that. So I think there's a political element, I think, which is really important around about where do we go politically. And then there's a strategic discussion as well around about how does Europe defend itself, because I think there is a possibility that the US will withdraw from NATO, or certainly loosen in terms of the close working relationship that's there. NATO, whether you like it or not, over a period of time, I suppose, is kept the peace. Now, we'll wait and see where these kind of discussions go. The one concerning thing I think for myself at the moment is this the whole uncertainty about US, as there is in many areas, about their strategic position in this, both politically and in terms of defence. It just seems very quickly thought up. President Trump says something, his team says something, and then they kind of backtrack on a number of occasions. So it does need, I think, some careful consideration in terms of where we go for this. But there's no doubt that Europe's in the most dangerous position it's been in for a number of years. And I think that's why if President Putin is rewarded by what's happened in Ukraine, then I think that's just going to embolden him. And I think that's the real danger, I think, kind of going ahead. So we need level heads at this stage, because if not, if we make the wrong decisions, it's going to make Europe an even more dangerous place than it is at the moment.
Thank you, Paul. So many questions that I'd like to ask you next, Francis, about the same issue. I think I'm going to go with China. I think in one of the updates that I read out there, it said that China felt that Ukraine should be included at the table of any talks along with Europe, which is not what Trump seems to want, nor Putin either. And would you have expected China to come out with that, or would you have thought that they would side themselves with Putin and Trump?
That's an interesting one. I don't think China wants to signal that it is totally within Russia's orbit. That gets presented to the world a lot. We see it a lot economically, that, it's the Russia-China axis. And I don't think China thinks like that. I think it's China looking after its own interests, and actually being totally in Russia's axis is not really in China's interest. There's been quite a tricky relationship there for a very long time. If you look at the borders, China feels threatened by Russia just as everybody else does. So I'm not actually surprised that China does not want to see any expansion of Russia's orbit or at least not without Ukraine's consent. There is also the question of Taiwan, because we keep saying, China's going to take over Taiwan, but that's kind of one of the few places where the US might get interested because of the whole South China Sea thing. So again, China is maybe trying to send a signal that whatever territorial claims it makes, it wants them to be, shall we say, agreed by consent rather than imposed.
Paul, feel free to answer the same question. Where do you think China is? But I'm also kind of interested to hear from you if there's any discussions or debates in Holyrood about what's going on in Ukraine. But China first. Do you think that's going to be an important player?
Yeah, I think China will be an important player. There is obviously the discussions around about the defence, but this is about strategic interests as well. And I think Hegseth came out, the Defence Secretary in States, talked about their strategic interests. And their strategic interests, of course, isn't just in terms of defence, it's in terms of where they see trading and importance of that. So I think there's if it's in America's interest, it's not talking about just about defence, it's talking about economic interests as well. And I think that drives as much US foreign policy than anything else. And I think that can be concerning when he's saying about trying to look at their interests all over the world. So China obviously has an interest in that, and I think, as Francis said, China and Russia haven't been the best of friends over a number of years. They have had clashes in terms of policy and looking at that. So I think China's role in this is really important. Not almost as an honest broker, if you like, but almost trying to balance out what's going on in that regard. And I think we have to see. And I suppose the other key thing for me is you have to see if the Ukraine situation is discussed. It can't just be between President Trump and President Putin. Again, this is just completely overriding the sovereignty of Ukraine. And I've had the honour of meeting people in Scotland who've settled, have had to come to Scotland to get away from the war. And these people have sacrificed a lot to come over here and left their family and so on. They'll feel betrayed by this. And the Ukraine has to be part of the solution, front and centre as part of the solution. And it's not been discussed in the Parliament as such, and I'm sure it will be if we move towards some kind of discussions that are there. But the Scottish Parliament has been very, very supportive of the Ukrainian people over a long period of time since the invasion happened, and I'm sure that will not change. And Scotland had a strong Ukrainian community before the war even started, so we've got to make sure that their views are listened to as well. So that's the most important thing, that the sovereignty of Ukraine is protected as best as possible, and they have to be involved in discussions.
I'm just intrigued. I'm going to go into kind of, I don't know, wide blue yonder. So say Scotland is an independent country and has decided that it wants to rejoin the EU. Have you ever, and the EU is then thinking about building its own army. Have you ever had any conversations with any colleagues from any of the parties in Holyrood that would give you an idea as to whether they would think that was a good idea or not for an independent Scotland in the EU?
Not with other parties. I think one of the key things, though, Brian, is when you look at smaller European countries and the role they've played in peacekeeping. You just have to look at Denmark. You just have to look at Ireland in terms of that. And of course, Scotland would have to build up its own conventional forces. And we've been very clear it wouldn't be part of any nuclear weapons being sighted on in Scotland. But we would, I think, Scotland having its own defence policy would obviously be very different from the UK. It would need to obviously defend itself. But it's also got an important part to play in terms of how we play our part in peacekeeping. And I think we've seen that with small European countries, and I'm sure Scotland would follow that route. I don't think the other parties in the Scottish Parliament would want to go down that route. But I think it's something that I would be very, if we're looking to do that, Scotland plays its part in peacekeeping, as have other countries. Norway as well have done that over a period of years. So I'm sure that Scotland would play its part in that as well.
Thank you, Paul. Francis, do you mind if I just ask you one more thing before we leave this topic? We've still got a minute or so. I've heard people describe Trump as being transactional. We've seen it in Gaza when he talks about how it's like real estate, right for development. He wants minerals from Ukraine in return for military aid. And there was a podcast, a newsagent podcast, Emily Maitlis. She said she had an idea that Trump's view of the world is that Putin can do whatever he wants in Europe and his side of Asia. China can do whatever they want. You mentioned Taiwan, and he can do whatever he wants. He can take over Canada and Greenland. He can do whatever he wants. Is that do you think, is that a reasonable theory in terms of economics? I'm thinking, I suppose.
That might be how Trump sees things. I certainly think the threat to annex Canada and Greenland has not much to do with minerals. In Canada's case, it has quite a lot to do with oil, but a lot to do with Arctic shipping lanes and who controls those. I think it would be more correct, I think, to say that Trump sees the world in terms of great powers. It's kind of almost like the Mearsheimer view, that it's great powers negotiate and great powers decide what they will do, and everybody else falls neatly into line, which actually we in Britain should recognise this, because it's how Britain operated when it was an empire. Britain decided what it would do as the empire, and everybody else fell neatly into line. So in that respect, it's quite an old-fashioned way of looking at things, a 19th century way of looking at things. But that seems to be how he sees things in terms of big powers. There's the US, there's Russia, which he seems to regard as the big power in Europe. And there's China, and he treats China with a great deal of respect, actually. He's obviously posturing and threatening and all the rest of it, imposing tariffs on it. But to my mind, he still does treat China as this is a big boy I have to negotiate with. And everybody else falls into line. So, yeah, I can threaten Denmark. They're just a little player. They're in the EU. Who cares? The EU doesn't matter. The EU is going to collapse. I can threaten Canada because Canada's, it's a big geographically. It's only a little country and it's on our borders, and the border is artificial anyway, and it should be ours. So we're just going to take it. And the same with Panama. The canal is ours. If we have to go and invade, well, we'll go and invade, because that is how he's thinking of things, is in terms of big trading blocks, where to his mind these kind of relationships make sense, and whether they make sense to the people involved doesn't seem to be at the forefront of his mind. I think that's kind of what's going on with Gaza, where what happens to 2 million people, he says, I want them to have better lives, but he hasn't thought about at all where those better lives will be. And when he says, they'll go to Egypt and Jordan will just make parcels of land available to them, and with no real recognition of the political realities for Egypt and Jordan if they do that, which are profound and extremely destabilising for the entire region. So I think it's it is this very simplistic way of looking at things that doesn't really take into account the rather more complex political realities of the world as it is today. But it does signal, I think, an important point which people have been making for some years now, that we're moving away from America as the hegemon of the whole world towards a multipolar world with big powers again, a much more sort of multi-empire view of the world.
Thank you, Francis. I knew it would be worth coming back to you for one more shot at that question. No, seriously, I agree. I think that it does. There's a whiff of colonialism about these days, which is hard to reconcile. But so the next item is the UK economy. This week's GDP figures showed the UK economy continues to flatline, with growth at just 0.1% in December. The Bank of England halving UK economic growth predictions. How can the Chancellor find the money to pay for investment to create growth and increase defence spending while facing threats of tariffs from Trump? And this comes, I think earlier this week, there was a leaked Office for Budget Responsibility, or OBR, report, which warned that Rachel Reeves has lost her £9 billion of supposed fiscal headroom. And it was a buffer that she hoped would provide room to manoeuvre in the upcoming budget. Francis, this is clearly one for you to start with. I suppose 0.1% isn't too bad, because predictions were that we would go into recession. Is that right?
We're bumping around zero, actually. Whether it's below the line or above the line, it's neither here nor there. We're basically bumping around zero, and have been for some time. And that's a projection pretty much going forward as well, is that we're not going to get much above zero. The one, I guess, the one bright glimmer on Reeves's horizon is that the Bank of England is cutting interest rates gradually, and that will slightly improve the government's fiscal position, because it'll eventually be paying less in interest. But then we've got Trump's tariffs coming up, which are going to create inflationary pressure in the UK, and so may restrict the Bank of England's ability to cut interest rates. So she's in quite a bind, actually, because we've got to kickstart growth. I actually think this whole calculus is the wrong way round. How are we going to earn the money to pay for investment in order to get growth? In order to get growth, you need to invest. Any business will tell you that. So I'm struggling to see why, when it comes to government, this whole relationship between investment and growth is reversed from what it is for a corporation, where you borrow to invest, and your investment generates growth, and that pays back your debt, or it enables you to service your debt, or whatever. And there are exceptions to this, as we have seen with the likes of Thames Water. But in general, that's how investment works in a corporate world. But for some reason, when it comes to governments, we kind of turn around and say, no, you've got to earn the money from growth before you can afford to invest. Well, this doesn't make a great deal of sense. So for me, I think she has made a rod for her own back. She has given herself a set of fiscal rules that actually don't allow her to do the kind of investment that is really needed. And the kind of investment she's going for as well is like these kind of high profile, massive kind of boondoggles, like Third Runway at Heathrow, rather than the kind of less headline grabbing but more significant changes that can make a real difference to people's lives and to the productivity of particularly small businesses, like investing in local transport networks. It's a bit of a no-brainer. So I'm not actually seeing a very competent Chancellor, I have to say.
Thank you, Francis. Paul, tell me if I'm wrong, but from what Francis was saying there, we're talking about productivity here, and when I hear people talk about productivity, first thing that comes into my head is like, oh, I'm going to be expected to take a pay cut and work longer hours and make whatever it is that I work in a factory to make. I'm going to have to make more of them more quickly for less. But it's not what Francis is talking about when it comes to productivity. It's better transport links means that your product gets to the marketplace quicker, which then increases productivity. And I'm kind of thinking, in that bit, investing in infrastructure, would you say that, for example, Grangemouth not being invested in or not being saved by Rachel Reeves, as Anna Sarwar said it would be, would that have been a productivity or an investment opportunity missed?
Yeah, I think in terms of productivity, it's always been a problem for the UK, and Scotland's obviously is tied into part of that system. I think one opportunity we've got at the moment is obviously around about the growth in renewables, but we have to make sure that the infrastructure is around about that as well. And I've been involved in discussions with my House Minister Halton, for example, around about likes of SSEN and Scottish Power looking around about housing. In terms of there's obviously a need for construction workers in terms of these projects, but what can we do then to leave a legacy? And housing is an opportunity to leave a legacy in terms of that. Sustainable transport, I think, is an opportunity to make sure that we do that as well. So I think we've got the growth in renewables has to be well thought of as well. So we're talking about what's the opportunities for training around that to make sure when we're developing these projects that people leave with obviously more training and are better developed in that way as well. So I think there's that long-term thought that the government have got, or medium to long-term thought, obviously, in terms of once the construction, some of these projects are over, what sustainably can we take away? Housing, skills, transport, I think, is some of these issues I think are really important in terms of that. And I think one of the biggest things I've seen from a constituency point of view, also, and it comes back to the point that Francis made around about the Chancellor not being competent, national insurance contributions used to be referred to and still are referred to as a tax on jobs. And we've certainly seen that in my own constituency and right across Scotland. It's not only impacted companies, obviously charities are having to pay people off as well, but it's also impacting on investment opportunities. So companies are having to pay more than national insurance companies rather than investment. So it's a vicious circle that continues, and you're right, Brian. In terms of Grangemouth, there was an opportunity to look around about how the UK government could have invested in Grangemouth to again to provide that future as we move on. And again, it would provide, because cleaner aviation fuel was an opportunity for Grangemouth. They chose not to do that, and that's going to impact on the whole area. So investment decisions are one part of the discussion. The national insurance contributions point was raised. The budget and put through has having a real impact on jobs right now and in companies right now. But it also takes away from investment opportunities, which, as you said, increases productivity. So I'm not seeing a strategic overview from the UK government at this particular stage. They need to change tact on that because people are disinvesting at the moment rather than investing, and it's impacting on jobs right now. And we're seeing that right across the UK.
Thank you, Paul. Francis, you said that Rachel Reeves had made a rod for her own back. So the question is, what's she going to do next? Is she going to raise taxes, or is she going to double down on austerity and make more cuts? I suppose we've got a double-sided question for you about that. What do you think Rachel Reeves will do? Will she increase taxes or go with austerity? And what do you think she should do? Or are they the same thing?
Well, at the moment, she seems to be trying to force regulators to soften the rules so that banks can lend more riskily and things like that. So much so that Andrew Bailey, the chairman of the Bank of England, has actually had to issue a bit of a warning about, hang on a minute, regulators' first job is to keep the system safe, and growth that comes from risky behaviour is not sustainable. And now that should not have to be said. So, which is one of the reasons why I'm questioning her competence, because that was actually quite a dangerous message. Not as dangerous as some of the messages that Liz Truss was sending, but certainly nod in that direction, and they're very uncomfortable about it. So what I think she's probably going to do, yes, there's going to be austerity. She has signalled that already. She seems to have this idea, and it was reinforced by Keir Starmer in a totally bizarre speech in which he essentially pretty much said no young person is ever disabled, which is nonsense. There's going to be a big clampdown on disability benefits, particularly, I think, and to try and force more people who are not currently working because they're sick or disabled into work. So more hardship for some very vulnerable people. I don't think this is going to raise a huge amount of money, actually. I don't think it's going to give her the fiscal headroom that she needs. I can't see how she's going to achieve what she wants without raising taxes, unless she bites the bullet, excludes investment spending from her calculations of national debt, and goes for a much larger investment in much larger public investment in all sorts of things, with the explicit goal of raising productivity, really, which is dismal in the UK. That's what I think she should do, is go for much more public investment and stop tying herself down to a set of fiscal rules that really aren't fit for purpose. What I think she will do is continue tinkering the edges and trying to magic up growth while squeezing the private sector and the most vulnerable people in society. I'm actually really disappointed.
Thank you, Francis. Paul, if what Francis says there is true, and that Rachel Reeves is not going to invest in infrastructure, for example, which I would imagine then would mean consequentials coming down the line for the Scottish Parliament, and if she does just continue to pile on austerity, how is that going to affect the Scottish government? Would you raise taxes or follow suit and use austerity?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things. I think the debt ceilings that the Chancellor has set are self-imposed, and I think that's one thing that should be looked at seriously in terms of that. The UK, in terms of how it invests in the economy, is way behind other countries in terms of that, and obviously impacts on our productivity as well. And I think that's one of the key things. I think she missed an opportunity in the budget to tax those who earn higher. And I think that's, if you looked at traditional left of centre governments, and the Scottish government's got a history of doing that, and it's taxing people who earn more. And that's always been my politics in terms of that. The people who earn more should pay more. And of course, it's not as simplistic as that, but it's, we've got to look at in terms of, where the debt burden should lie in terms of that, and people who earn more should pay more. And I think that's the case. In terms of Scotland, it then comes back to where our hands are tied in terms of this as well. We can't encourage investment, even though Scotland does very well. There's opportunities around about, the ability to looking at tax breaks for those who invest. We can't do that in Scotland at all. And I think that ties our hands in that regard as well. And it comes back to the productivity challenge that's there as well. And it comes back to what we can do as an independent nation, as other European countries have the ability to do so. So we are very much restricted by what the UK government does. But coming back to your original point, I think that she has tied her own hands behind her own back, because what she will do is tax, is look at the benefits. And we've already had that indicated as well, as looking at disability benefits and look at austerity. And when we've seen the budget, we had an opportunity to look at those who obviously look at you talked about the fuel allowance, the two-child cap, and so on. These were an opportunity. The local housing allowance being frozen again. These were an opportunity to take people out of debt. And I think that's one of the key things that's not being discussed in the budget. Of course, we need to look at growth, but there are still lots of people who are in really difficult positions. And about the fuel allowance, the two-child cap, and obviously local housing allowance as well. So she missed that opportunity as well from a social aspect, and I think she has to tie that. She has to obviously make sure that's part of her considerations going forward as well, because all she's doing is making poverty worse in the UK. And Scotland have made a choice, for example, about the Scottish child payment, and I think that indicates where the Scottish government would go. But she's in a difficult position, and I can't see much growth over the next number of years either under the current policy that she's operating on.
So you don't have your eye on any consequentials coming down the pipeline for
It-
Scotland?
Again, Brian, that would depend obviously if there was additional spend, or she raised the public raised the debt ceiling, where would the funds be? And again, that would be depending on where the UK government would spend on that, depending on where the consequentials would come from. Of course, we would welcome that. In terms of that, I would much rather be in a position we have the ability to do that on our own as an independent country. But if the consequentials come through, then that's something we would need to look about how we would spend on that. But that would be based very much on what the UK government spend the additional monies on.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Paul. I'll be coming to you first for this next item. There have been two reports this week which emphasise a problem with key decisions not being made in Scotland. One report said that the GB Energy would struggle to find a CEO to move to their Aberdeen HQ because the salary on offer was too low. I don't know if anybody saw the video that was put out by somebody, part of the guild, City Guild in Aberdeen, about why Abermonians, I think it was called. The second report said the Scottish Government should plan to cut teacher numbers and school classrooms as pupil numbers are predicted to fall as our population ages in Scotland. Anis Sarwar a wee while back called for a Scottish visa to encourage immigrants to come to Scotland to boost the Scottish economy, but that hasn't been approved or taken up by the UK government. Paul, why does the UK government refuse to agree to a Scottish visa, which would boost our economy?
Yeah, I think that's more a political discussion, a more a political point that they're trying to make. When you look right across Scotland, for example, and I talked about the renewables earlier on as well, and the growth in construction required for that, and its impacts on house building as well, is overwhelming. Because I know in terms of some companies at the moment that they will fly workers across from Europe on a Monday and fly them back on a Friday because they can't get a visa in terms of that. So Scotland desperately needs that to bring people across to work in Scotland, to contribute in Scotland, and that goes towards, for example, the renewable sector and house building sector. So that's an absolutely crazy position. Again, this comes back to, I think, more a political discussion. That if we'd had some abilities for visa exemptions, and also talking about the rural sector as well, then it would grow the Scottish economy much quicker. That's incredibly important. So that's more political. I don't know in terms of that. GB Energy, I think we've seen the interview in the last week or so where you heard the chief executive talk around about it might take 20 years to get to 1,000 jobs. And again, if we want to grow GB Energy or the renewable sector, then there are many things that we need to look at. And again, it comes back to the Scottish visa argument in terms of that. Now, Anis Sarwar can come and speak and say that he's had discussions, and I think last week we'd seen that there was a doubt that he'd even had a meeting around about that. And Scottish Labour are ignored. We've seen that through the winter fuel allowance, we've seen that through the two-child cap, we've seen that through lots of other things. Scottish Labour have no influence over UK Labour in any way, shape or form. So, and I think that's a key part. And again, it comes back to the levers. We have to grow our economy and so on. And I think, our welfare position, we talked around about the disabilities discussions. UK Labour just ignores Scottish Labour in terms of that. Quite simply, we need to make the decisions in Scotland by the people of Scotland, because we would make different decisions to grow our economy than we would being part of the UK government establishment. So I think it's very clear. It's more political because there are so many glaring examples around about how Scotland could perform better with the visa, for example. It would allow us to bring more people in to work and grow the sector as quicker. So it's political. It's not economic.
Thank you, Paul. Francis, I'm keen to find out whether you agree with Paul, whether this is a political issue. I'm also just wondering, maybe, can you see why the UK government doesn't agree with a Scottish visa? Firstly, do you agree with Paul that it's political? Sorry.
Oh, of course it's political. Yeah, totally. If you look at this economically, Scotland is not the only part of the UK that actually needs immigration. The problem is that the parts of the UK that particularly need immigration are the ones most opposed to it, where the existing residents are the most opposed to it. It is very plain to me that the Labour government is every bit as nervous as the Tories about the rise of reform. And so it does not want to give any signal at all that it's soft on immigration. It's not going to allow that any softening anywhere in the UK, and that's why it won't agree to a Scottish visa. That is the reason. It feels it needs to keep central control of immigration. It's a huge amount of rhetoric at the moment about essentially trying to bring immigration down significantly from where it was when the Tories were in power. Slightly unfairly, because of course the immigration figures in the last couple of years of the Tories' tenure were massively pumped up by Ukrainian and Hong Kong refugees. There was a spike that was always going to come down. But that said, we are, as a country, reliant upon guest workers, on people who come from overseas. We don't have a Gastarbeiter system like Germany has, where we have people who are literally just here as guests to work and they don't ever have a right to remain. We don't have that, and I'm not convinced that we should, because I don't think it helps with integration. If we want people to come here to put down roots and make a life and become part of us, rather than remaining separate, and guest worker schemes and making it more difficult for people to become citizens, as I think the Tories have suggested, is not a way to do that. It's moving in the wrong direction. So it's really a question of how we square the fact that actually our economic growth enormously depends upon immigration. We don't really have any other source of economic growth right now. Because we've managed to transform ourselves from an economy that was investment-led, innovation-led, into an economy that depends essentially on getting more and more people to work. That's been the case for the last 14, 15 years, and we aren't turning that round at the moment. So while we continue to be casting all our policy towards getting more people to work and not investing in the economy to improve productivity, we're going to continue to need immigration. That's where we are. And the sooner the Labour Party wakes up and recognises that and stops trying to park its tanks on reform's lawn, the better.
Thank you, Francis. Thank you also for mentioning reform. But Paul, both you and Francis are agreed that it's a political issue, this immigration thing, but is it also fair then to say that really what we're talking about here is Brexit, and it's still not over yet, it's not done with us yet? Is that a fair comment to make? And feel free to bring in Farage there as well if you want.
Yeah, I think Brexit will continue to have an impact. It's not. I remember when we had problems before, it was referred to as teething problems. Well, these teething problems now are continuing, and I think we've seen various studies carried out. It's impacting on the UK about £40 billion a year, £4 to £5 billion in Scotland, impact on our economy every single year, and that will continue. That's not teething problems. The point Francis makes around about reform is really important, because poll after poll after poll, and there's just one out today, shows that Reform are taking primarily votes away from Labour, not the Tories, but votes away from Labour. So they're obviously impacted on that as well. We hear silence from the Labour Party on Brexit. They don't even mention it in the Parliament. You will hear silence on Reform in terms of that as well. So Brexit will continue to have an ongoing impact. And again, it comes back to the whole point around about independence and then getting us back into the EU, and I think that, we need a grown-up discussion about this, and because all we hear around about the discussion just now is very negative. People coming into Scotland, migration into Scotland has proved to be economically beneficial, and there are various studies that show that, and we need to change the debate and discussion around about the opportunities that migration brings to Scotland and the economic benefits of that, and again coming back to integrating people into Scotland. We've got a proud history of doing that, and I'm hopefully, and we'll continue to do so. But we need to change the debate in terms of the economic benefits that it brings, and it has done in the past, and it will do in the future when Scotland becomes independent.
Thank you, Paul. Francis, I wonder if now that Farage has come up, and still to do with immigration and around that, I don't know if you, like me, had to pinch yourself earlier this week when there was a poll which said if there was a general election now that Farage would be Prime Minister. Tell me if I've misunderstood that poll.
Just That's not just on share of the vote, and it doesn't tell you anything about the distribution of the votes, which under first past the post system does matter. So no, that poll is not accurate. He would not be Prime Minister. It would be a very uncomfortable situation, though, because he would be potentially the leader of the largest party in terms of votes, but not the largest party in terms of seats. Those who are in favour of proportional representation might want to think about that one.
But for that clarification, then you can always be assured that I get something wrong. But what I really was wanting to go on to was with polls like that coming out, it kind of proves that, or gives evidence to the notion that Starmer is running scared from Farage. And we saw that at PMQs last week when Starmer agreed 3 times with Kemi Badenoch that a family should not have been reunited, a family of Palestinians should not have been reunited using the visa scheme for Ukrainians to come into the UK. And that loophole should be closed. Again, I don't know if you pinched yourself. I don't know if you caught PMQs this week, but again, I was pinching myself when I saw that. 3 times he agreed with Badenoch that
I'm not actually very surprised by that, because Starmer's views on Gaza, to my mind, have been really quite racist. I'll use that term deliberately. He does not regard Palestinians as of being of the same value as Israelis. That's been apparent from the word go. And so it doesn't surprise me that he would not want a scheme designed to reunite families, which is what the Ukrainian scheme does, to apply to a people that he fairly plainly despises and doesn't want in this country. So it doesn't surprise me at all, and I don't think it has anything to do with Farage. I think it has to do with Starmer's own views.
Thank you, Francis. Paul, just before we go, is there anything that you'd like to add to Francis's comments?
I think Labour's position and Starmer's position on the Gaza situation has been very weak. Labour have had to be pushed into some of the situations. It's very clear around about where they place the importance of this, and it's very much on supporting Israel in terms of what they're trying to do. But Starmer, and coming back to the broader point, Starmer can't just be part of the right wing shift in the UK. It just can't join the Tories and reform in terms of agreeing in terms of where we go. Migration plays an important part in the UK economy. We're obviously seeing jobs in shortages in the number of areas. Construction being one, care being another. In terms of this, he needs to stand up and talk around about the benefits of immigration, the benefits of migration into this. If not, we'll continue to see a right wing shift towards that. The Labour Party can't be part of that. They can't be, and that's part of the reason I think why they're losing votes in the UK, but also losing votes in Scotland. I'm proud we've got a government here that will stand up to that and support migration, as we have done over a number of years, and will continue to do so.
Thank you, Paul. Just we're pretty much out of time, and it's but just really quickly on that issue about that family, that Palestinian family, which a court ruled that could be reunited under the Ukrainian visa scheme. Could the Scottish Government pick that up and invite that family to Scotland via the Ukrainian system, which is in place? And as you said, we've already got Ukrainians coming here. Could you kind of like sidestep it?
But I'm not sure of the full details. Obviously, we'd need to see that. I mean, Scotland has a very proud record of taking Ukrainian refugees, for example, and I think that's one of the most important part of it. Proportionately, I think Scotland took around about 20% of the number of people that settled in from the Ukraine in terms of that. So we've traditionally been very supportive of that. Again, coming back to the scheme, we have to discuss this with the UK government as well. So these are things that we need to look at more details. But obviously, again, having our own independent policy around about that would make it much more welcome to do that. But can't comment on that specific case without knowing the full details. Again, that's the barriers in terms of that. So.
Can I jump in quickly on this one?
Please, yes, please.
Yeah, because what the court has actually said is that the Ukrainian scheme must apply to Gazans because it's the European Convention of Human Rights, Article 8, which is about the right to a family life, and they're saying that you can't apply Article 8 to Ukrainians and not to Gazans, that it must be applied across the board. So if you have a scheme that enables Ukrainians to join their families in the UK, you must also have, similarly, have a scheme that enables Gazans to join their families in the UK. Now the Home Office says it's going to look at closing that loophole, but I can't see how they can do that because they've got no power whatsoever to override the European Convention on Human Rights, short of leaving the European Convention on Human Rights, which is absolutely parking your tanks on Farage's lawn.
Yeah.
Thank you, Francis, for that. And we started late, so we're going to finish late. I hope that's okay with you both. Just really quickly, Paul, and then I'll let you go on with what's left of the weekend. So with that in mind, so when it comes to the Ukrainian visa scheme, does the Scottish Government decide who comes into Scotland via that scheme, or are we just allocated a certain number and the decision is made from Westminster as to who comes in on that scheme? Do you have any power to...
Yeah, again, coming back to that specific point, it would depend on the circumstances, Brian, in terms of this, as you said, over the scheme that we've had for a number of years, or the last couple of years, obviously, in case of that. And obviously, we are, in terms of the flexibility around that scheme, we have tried to work and be as flexible as we possibly can. So, again, it would very much still depend on, on how that scheme kind of develops, kind of going forward as well. So, again, I think that very much depends on what we can do, depends on whether the UK government can place a position going forward as well. And again, based on that, is that position going to change? I'm not sure. If that's the case, we've seen Reform talking about the number of Ukrainian people settling here as well, which I just find absolutely shocking, terrible in terms of that. We welcome people in terms of that. I mean, you've looked at some of the situations about people arriving from different countries. It's very much based on decisions that are made by the UK and US governments in terms of foreign policy, which creates situations in terms of why we see people arriving in the UK and Scotland.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Another good point. Thank you both, Francis and Paul, for your patience with me. But that is it this week for the Full Scottish. And before we go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of you, our supporters. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. We did raise £20,000 from April to the end of 2024, but that's 16,000 short of our target. We've since borrowed £12,000 to help us pay our bills and to keep going, but the pressure is still on and we need to find enough regular donors to give us financial security. Our costs are around £4,000 every month, but we get donations gratefully received of about £2,500. So more regular subscribers is the answer to clear our debts. But our programmes will always be free to view, you know that. But if you can afford £5 a month or any small donation at all, please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter and donate whatever you can afford. Meanwhile, thank you once again to Francis, and thank you also to Paul, our guest this weekend. I'll let you, as I say, get on with what's left of the weekend. Thank you to you at home for watching. Goodbye.